just yeah, to start, it's a real pleasure to be here. And thanks all for coming. Okay, yes, so I've got 10 minutes, and 10 minutes, the good news is that in 10 minutes, it's hard to be really ridiculous, but I'm going to do my best. So here, let's get straight in. So let's begin by saying something I completely made up. So this is my own theory of technological change. So I think that what happens when, as technology progresses, is it goes through 3 phases. And so in the first phase, it's what I call idiotic. So idiotic means that it's better not to use it than to use it. So if you think of the early internet, imagine the internet sort of early 1990s, every web page took 20 minutes to load. It was completely useless and a waste of time. Okay, after that, we progress to phase 2. Phase 2 I call ludic. So the ludic phase is where it's not actually useful, but it's kind of fun. So this is illustrated here by this classic 1996 web page, the virtual vomit page. I don't know if you can see it. It's really fun. You can select stomach contents, for example. And it was pages like this, of course, that led the New York Times to declare in 1997 that the web is a ridiculous clover leaf to nowhere. And finally, of course, we come out of the tunnel, and the web actually, or the technology actually becomes pragmatic. So we have things like the human miracle that is Wikipedia, and a recent study by the US Federal Reserve estimated that people would pay an average of about $20,000 per year in order to they'd have to be paid that in order to give up internet access for a year. So the internet is actually useful. Okay, so why am I telling you this? Because I think that AI is going through the same 3 stages. So early AI, basically until about now, has been in the idiotic phase. And anyone who's tried to interact with online assistants on their phone, for example, is well aware of this. Here's an example. I'm not going to read it out, but it's quite funny. I think that round about now, 2021, we are passing from the idiotic phase to the ludic phase. So this is my favorite example is Delphi. I don't know if you've seen Delphi. It's produced by Alan AI, but Delphi is a sort of ethical tool where you can put in propositions and it tells you, it comments on them in a moral sense. So for example, if you say, these are examples that I put in. So what does Delphi think about brushing your hair with a loo brush? Okay, Delphi thinks it's disgusting. Well, that's what I would think too. That's not bad. Okay, going scuba diving with kittens tied to your wetsuit. What does it think? It's weird. So it's sort of, you can see it's not bad. I mean, it is weird to do that, but at the same time, it's also vaguely psychopathic, which is a nuance which Delphi misses. And then finally, things like putting your children to bed at midnight. It's bad. So Delphi just alienated the entire population of Spain, but never mind, it's not too bad. Okay, so AI is becoming actually fun. And, maybe around the corner is the pragmatic phase. Who knows? Okay, so the title of my talk is the initial title of my talk is Shaking Your Foundation. So this is a reference to a new term. It's a term which has emerged just really in the last few months, and it was proposed by this paper here, which is a consortium of people loosely based around Stanford. And what they're referring to is what they call foundation models. And foundation models is this term which is being applied to very large generative models, which are actually not quite as rubbish as AI was in the past. And I'm going to give you some examples. So this is an example that I really like. So it's an example called Dali. So this is made by OpenAI. So Dali is a synthesis of Wall-E, which is the sort of dubious film where AI take over the world and do everything for you, and Salvador Dali. So, 2 sort of relatively questionable concepts merged into one, but Dali is actually really good. So, for example, what it is, it's a text to image generator, the generative model. So, what we would call an artist. And what you can do is you can say, please generate, for example, a photo of a phone from the insert decade. And here are some examples. And these are images that it's made up. They're not copied from the internet. And, I don't know if you can see very well, but they're actually pretty good. So, Dali doesn't really know what phones from the early 2000s look like, but it figures that technology from the early 2000s is a bit clunky and has large buttons. So it sort of generates things like that. And it knows that in the olden days, phones were made of wood and had sort of strange things attached to them, and dials and stuff. And it gets that. And, you can ask it about phones in the distant future. And, it works out that they'll have fewer buttons and bigger screens. That's just pretty good extrapolation. So, this is, I think, not too bad. last week, DeepMind released a language agent, a language generative model. This, of course, is building on language, text-to-text language models, generative models that have been built in various other places, including OpenAI. And DeepMind's stab at it is also not too bad. It's called Gopher, and this is an example from the paper that they released. And it's a dialogue. It's a dialogue in which the user asks Gopher to tell it something about cell biology. And clearly it's a cherry-picked example, but Gopher is pretty well informed. It gets most things right. It knows also to some extent what it doesn't know, and it's able to reply in natural language fairly usefully and point you to new sources of information that complement its own knowledge. So, I would argue that this is actually the future. So these models are going to get a lot better, and we're going to be using them all the time very soon. So question, what does this mean for psychology and neuroscience? So one answer might be nothing, right? So, people might reasonably argue these models in AI they're large, over-engineered tools for doing specific things in machine learning research or AI research. They're not realistic models for biology. But I'm going to argue the opposite. So I'm going to argue that actually these tools, what they do is they throw down a gauntlet for us in neuroscience, and they invite us to consider the limitations of the way we do research at the moment. And also they invite us to consider new challenges and opportunities for what we can do in the future. Okay, so I'm going to talk about three challenges, three limitations in neuroscience that I think this work exposes. The first I call integration, and that's that it's a sort of, it's an open secret in neuroscience that we do our research in silos. So what this means is that, people who study vision don't generally care all that much about memory. And people who study language don't generally care all that much about attention, and so on and so on. And because we study brain areas and domains of cognitive function in isolation, what we don't do is put them all together and try to build general theories. So we don't try to solve what might ultimately be the really hard problem, which is how does everything fit together? And the reason I highlight this is because in AI research, whether you like it or not, you've got to try and solve that hard problem if you want to build a fancy agent. And that's because your agent doesn't work if it can't see, and it doesn't work if it can't move, and it doesn't work if it doesn't have any memory. So you need to not only specify the individual parts, you need to specify how they fit together. And this is an example. I could have chosen many examples. There's an example from Jürgen Schmidhuber's lab from a few years ago. And it's what it is, arguably, this is an AI architecture. He calls it a world model. But I would say this is a theory of how the brain works, right? So broadly what it is, it's a generative model known as a variational autoencoder, on top of which there is some kind of recursive, like recurrent planning module. And there is a control process which reads out and formulates a policy on the basis of a prediction that is made into the future by the recurrent architecture that leverages the generative model. Okay, that's a theory of how the brain works. It might be wrong, but it's a theory at least. And I don't think, I think that we in neuroscience should be trying to build theories that look like this. Okay, the second challenge I think that's laid down is what I call grounding. So the brain learns representations from scratch. But what we do in neuroscience instead, what we tend to do is we tend to endow our models with representations by hand. And that's cheating. Now, it's cheating for a good reason. But the point is that if we want to understand how brains actually learn, then we need to build models that learn representations for themselves. So let me give you an example. So, about 15 years ago, we discovered these neurons in the medial temporal lobe that respond to multimodal concepts. So, pictures of an individual or the text of their written name, or other representations or other information associated with a particular individual. This is on the top here is Jackie Chan. This is a Jackie Chan neuron from a paper by Rodrigo Juan Quiroga. And this is a very exciting concept, but we have no idea of how these neurons are formed. What do you need to make a neuron? We don't have a computational theory. But okay, along comes a different model. This is actually a an image to text model, also from OpenAI, known as CLIP. And it relies on a computational principle which should be familiar to all of us. It's called predictive coding. It's a particular instantiation of predictive coding, but it relies largely on a form of hierarchical predictive coding in which predictions are made in a latent space, which is a sort of key hallmark of biological predictive coding. And what happens in this network is it forms concept neurons, and it forms actually some of the same concept neurons that have been observed in humans. So neurons that respond to semantic concepts like Christmas or West Africa, or to particular people, characters from sitcoms or famous films or Luke Skywalker and things like this, right? And, I think that what this shows us is that we can turn to these models and, we can start to try to understand how concepts are grounded. Lastly, dynamics. So there's another way in which we cheat, and we cheat when we fit models. And that is that, if you fit a model to data which unfolds in time, so for example, in a reinforcement learning experiment, inevitably what you're going to do is every time the model makes a choice, you're going to give it feedback, not on the basis of the choice that it made, but on the basis of the feedback of the individual that you're modeling. So that in machine learning is called teacher forcing. So we constantly retether our models to the biological agents that we're trying to understand. And in machine learning, you don't get the luxury to do that. Your model literally just has to sort of roll out, right? And it just has to kind of do stuff. This is an example from DeepMind. It's an example which I particularly like. They trained agents to do things on the basis of natural language prompts. So this is a large amount of supervised learning, also a lot of RL as well, on the basis of human data. And this is an agent which is acting in this 3D environment, and it's doing, it can respond to instructions like tidy the room. This is also relevant to the grounding point, of course, because in the end, one of the big things that we really struggle to understand is how is it that we can give a participant instructions in a psychology experiment and they just do it. They just do the task. That's something that we don't even begin to try and understand. And I think that AI research is going to give us the opportunity to start studying that. Okay, so I'm running out of time, but I just want to say very quickly a couple of more things, right? So what can we do about this? And so the first thing I do is point you to this paper, which I think, kind of we address some of these questions with Andrew Sachs and Steph Nelly, two people who used to be on my lab. And this was a paper written last year in Nature Reviews Neuroscience called "If Deep Learning is the Answer, Then What is the Question?" But I think, again, there are three things we can do, and I want to go through them really quickly. First one is, don't be a sheep, right? So what do I mean by that? And what I mean by that is, well, there's a lot of interest in deep networks as theories for neurobiology. And I think that what a lot of people are starting to do is taking these models off the shelf and taking benchmarks off the shelf and just saying, hey, this is a bit like the macaque brain, or this is a bit like the human brain. And I think we can do better than that. I think what we can do is we can, we can, rather than substituting our research paradigms for machine learning benchmarks, rather than throwing away our neural theories and saying, oh, it's all just complicated and neural networks are just massive function approximators and they're fundamentally uninterpretable, as some have been tempted to say, we should actually continue to embrace the notion of structured computation. And the way to do that is to try and understand how these networks work, right? To study your network. So deep networks are often argued to be black boxes, but I think, we're increasingly seeing that is not necessarily the case. They don't have to be. Right. And, we can use tools like neural geometry. This is a plug for an example from my lab, from my PhD student, Timo Flesch. You can use the analysis of neural geometry to try to understand the principles, the computational principles by which neural networks learn and structure computations. And then you can try to examine how those principles may be shared in biological organisms too, to understand their behavior. And I don't have time to go into this example, but I think it is possible to do. And then lastly, I think we need to embrace cognition. And, of course, cognitive scientists won't say, well, we've been embracing cognition for 50 years, and they'd be right. But, if we think about computational neuroscience, this is a wordle generated from the abstracts of cosine a few years ago. And, it's brilliant. There are terms that I love here. There's things like neurons, information processing, a network, really important concepts. But there's also concepts missing. Like, where's memory in this? It is actually here, but it's really tiny. Where's human? And, where's we increasingly, I think, as computational neuroscientists, have focused on low-level principles to the exclusion of these kind of more cognitive principles. And I think if we want to understand, or to harness the promise of AI, we need to think about the whole system and how information is structured across the system. And people in machine learning are interested in this, right? So this is a recent paper from my colleague at DeepMind, Andrew Lampinen. It's called Towards Mental Time Travel, right? A concept which we owe to Endel Tulving in the 1990s, and involves things like attention and memory. Even language models. Language models involve memory processes. This is a recent example from OpenAI in which they built a language model. They tried to use a language model to summarize books. And to do so, they had to build a hierarchical memory process. It's not very good. But perhaps if they had help from neuroscientists, they could do better. And, kind of increasingly, I think, as we see, language models tend to babble. They produce sort of, nonsensical, inconsistent sentences that don't entail one another. And, of course, that's because when we use language, we do so logically. We reason about language, and we have no theories of how reasoning can be applied to structure language. That's a tremendous opportunity for cognitive scientists and neuroscientists to embrace, and I hope we will do so going forward. Okay, so AI is coming, and soon it will be quite good. And I think that, kind of its advent exposes limitations in neuroscience and enjoins us to consider, what I've called integration, grounding, and dynamics. But we can respond, I think, by playing to our strengths. We are good at designing experiments. We're good at understanding computation in neural networks. And I think if we focus on these, we can make a real contribution to AI itself by focusing on the structure of information processing. Okay, thanks for listening.
Thanks, Chris. What a brilliant talk to start our day. Really, really interesting stuff. So just to remind people, if you have any questions for Chris or any of the speakers, please type them into the Q&A box on Zoom. I have a couple of questions I'd love to ask Chris, but there's one already here from Levan Bakaria, and he asks, regarding the point about integration and how AI can help, could you clarify exactly what insight will AI give for the problem of integration? He says, I think neuroscientists understand the importance of integration. It's just that individual components like vision, memory, etc., are too complicated. Will AI just help integration because of its huge brute force, computational capacity to hold large parts of information together, or by showing us examples where integrated models are more than the sum of the parts?
Yeah, I hope it's the latter. So the example that I gave, the world model, I could have given many examples, but it's a sort of, if you like it, the question that those researchers ask themselves is a neuroscientific question, right? It's like, what are the necessary and sufficient organization of the different components that make up a brain that will allow that system to behave in a way which, within the narrow confines of like the video game that they're tackling, that we might construe to be intelligent. And, they formulated a theory that says, well, kind of to various forms of control, to do good control, we need a model. And, kind of that model should be instantiated in the form of a kind of compressive deep neural network, which is what a VAE is. And they had to specify, not just in the abstract, well, there's a model and, kind of here are the states and we'll give it the states. They had to specify actually how the control process would interact with that model. And, you might say, okay, maybe the control process is like the basal ganglia, and maybe the recurrent neural network is like the prefrontal cortex, and maybe the VAE is like the ventral stream. And, you've got those three components and you've got to wire them up. And, I think if we continue to work individually without paying attention to what's going on in other parts of the field, then we risk, kind of just playing essentially, right? Kind of we'll try and solve in small individual problems, but actually the big problem, how it all fits together, will remain elusive. And that's not to denigrate, kind of the amazing research that goes on in these individual areas and the insights that we get from it. But ultimately, I think, kind of what we don't want is for AI researchers to say, well, kind of that ultimately that those insights are a bit obsolete, because look, here's how it works.
Yeah. I had a question about another one of your sort of core problems, with which AI might help, which is grounding. So, when you see these networks trained on pictures from the internet, and they can generalize to some extent, but of course, there's a strong theory that to really be effective, AI needs to be embodied. So you need to have a network that actually learns the same way a child does, from hours of experience in the real world. And of course, the idea of having simulated environments and games that DeepMind and others came up with is a great way to actually simulate an interaction of an agent inside a virtual environment, even if it's not a real environment. But how much can we learn from these virtual environments if they inevitably involve some approximations, like, I don't know if whether gravity is properly implemented, or friction, or other aspects. So really, these AIs need to be embodied in robots in the real world to properly be grounded.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. So if I'd wanted to plant a question, I would have planted that one, because it's a topic very dear to my heart, and we've written about this in my group. So I completely share your intuition. We have argued that actually there is, in a way, if you think about concepts, right, the most abstract concepts, cognitive scientists have typically argued are relational concepts, right? The ways in which things relate to each other, which are divorced from their physical properties, right? So the notion of something being inside something else, right? So if I go for a swim, I'm inside a swimming pool. And, if I put a book in my suitcase, it's inside. But those two things don't look anything alike, right? What does it mean for something to be inside? What does it mean for there to be three of something? How can we learn these concepts which are not, kind of tied to specific pixels in a grounded way? And so we've argued that actually, taking actions itself is an opportunity to ground these most relational, these most abstract of concepts. So, if there are three things, if you've got three cats and you've got to, you stroke them one by one, or there's three apples in a bunch and you pick them one by one, the grounding is in the sequence of actions. And, kind of the limits of these 3D worlds. Of course, these 3D worlds allow for a form of grounding, which is grounding in navigational space. And we've thought a lot about grounding in navigational space recently. And some people like Tim Behrens, have formulated theories that say, okay, well, actually, kind of grounding in the transition function allows for particular forms of abstractions. And there are even, kind of proof of concepts, demonstrations of that from computational neuroscience. But, kind of, I think that as primates, we're very dexterous and we use our hands a lot. As people, we probably use our hands to do almost everything. And grounding in reaching and grasping will be something which will be very difficult in these environments, because most of them are not set up to allow for that form of interaction with the environment. So I think we will need more complex environments that emphasize the sorts of problems that primates have evolved to solve.
So there's a brief question here about whether the slides are available. And I think this is being recorded, so hopefully you can listen offline. Gabrielle Gibson has a question. Thank you for the presentation. I'm wondering if you've heard of the website Neural Blender. It's a website where AI creates an image based on a phrase, word you put in a text box, but they're often quite abstract.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a proliferation now of, kind of text to image and image to text websites, and you can go and play with them. And, I think as we said, as I said at the beginning, we're sort of entering a phase in which AI is actually fun. And that's why these websites exist and people are willing to go and play with them. And there is actually a deeper point, which is that the acceleration of AI itself, I think, if there's ever going to be liftoff, I think that liftoff is going to come from the large quantities of human data that we generate by interacting ourselves with these agents, right? So it's all very well for these companies and research institutes to build their own environments, but ultimately, the environment that we really care about is the one that has humans in it. And so it's only by building these interfaces in which real people can go online and play with these things that we will generate the data that we actually need to train AI that is actually really good. And you've actually seen that. So Delphi was released a couple of months ago, and it was really bad, actually. And what happened instantly was a mass of adversarial attacks as people came in and tried to make it say something that was really silly.
Okay. Yeah. And
what's happened over the intervening period is it's got really good. And it's got much better, almost certainly, because they've been able to train on the data that they received from releasing it publicly.
Yeah, you anticipated my second question. I know we're overrunning, but a very quick answer. So the start, where you talk about the history of technology and possibly AI, Do you think that those stages you outlined are just because of gradual growth in computing power or the amount of data available for training on the web? Or do you think there's actually a paradigm shift at each stage from, I don't know, symbolic AI to artificial neural networks that can learn? And do you think there's, so very briefly, is it just a gradual case of more and more interactions between humans and these machines, or do we need real robots embodiment for a paradigm change?
Well, I think it's about, sorry to give this a very sort of capitalist answer, but I think it is actually about supply and demand, right? So I think that as soon as technologies become good enough that people actually want them, there's exponential. First of all, there's exponential investment, right? Which of course is an economic principle, but also just by having lots of people in the loop. Also generates the data and the scale, which allows the technology to evolve, right? So that clearly happens. It's clearly true in the internet, right? If there's only 3 people on the internet, it'd be quite boring.
Yeah.
And it's also true with AI, because when we interact with these systems, we generate the data that they need to train on.
Brilliant.